Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Vagrant, and I'm super excited to be giving this talk today. I followed the Institute basically from when it opened, and I think the core idea of like having interdisciplinary work as its focus is something that I think is really great. I also think that it's something we really need in computing going forward. So today I'm specifically going to focus on natural language processing, which is the kind of computing that I work on, and specifically about gender gaps in it. So my plan, if you've read the abstract, is to go through a couple of examples of work that I've done where there's technical operationalization of gender gaps. And then I will use this as motivation to talk about bigger picture epistemological gaps and how we think about gender as a field. And finally, I'm going to close with some thoughts on how we can close the gaps, but mainly focusing on the epistemological gaps, not really the technical gaps that I'll show you. So thank you, Ingmar, for the introduction, but this is what I look like without a mask on. I'm disabled, that's why I wear a mask, I'm not sick. My research interests are primarily in robustness, in the context of question answering and fairness. But I'm also interested just broadly in the social and technical aspects of NLP, and I should preface this by saying that this talk covers a lot of my social and socio-technical work and doesn't really touch on my technical, like purely technical work almost at all. So I'm happy to discuss it offline as well. And this is just a bit of background. I'm a second-year PhD candidate, before which I worked in industry, and I did an undergrad degree in computer science and linguistics. So that's kind of what my background is. So let's just begin with gender gaps. Everyone here is probably familiar with the idea of the gender wage gap or the gender pay gap. And essentially, it's just the idea that women get paid less to the dollar for exactly the same work as men do. And I'm not 100% sure. I'm wondering now if maybe everyone in this room has heard of natural language processing. Yeah, okay, so everyone seems pretty comfortable with it, but I just had this slide for the interdisciplinary audience, just in case, just to illustrate that, you know, anyone who's used spam filtering or a voice assistant or Google Translate or ChatGPT has definitely engaged with natural language processing. And so in the context of NLP, a gender gap essentially has to do with gaps in how gender in some form is processed, typically in how it surfaces in natural language. So an example, and this is an example of something that I just wrote a paper about, is how well can a language model, such as ChatGPT, reuse a pronoun for someone? This is important for coherence in discourse when you talk about people. But it's also important for harm-free computing, because in the best case, you might have gender stereotypes reflected in text, and that's already bad. And in the worst case, you might actually cause psychological harms through misgendering specific individuals. So I have an example of the kind of task that we consider. It's the doctor was tired because she had not slept well. And then it's fill in the blank task in literally the next sentence, where you say the doctor said that blank could not prescribe a higher dose. So does everyone here know what the correct answer is in this context? I'm seeing some nods, good. So the correct answer is she. But as you might imagine, we know already that language models absorb and replicate a lot of biases of lots of different kinds. And so, for example, they might associate doctors with the he pronoun. And so this would be an example of the model getting it wrong, if this is how the model chooses to fill the pronoun this way. And on the other hand, if the model assigns the highest probability to the pronoun she in this context, then that means that it's correctly reasoning and, you know, not really showing biased or incorrect behavior. So we look at a whole range of models, and this is just an average of the results. And we're looking also at thousands of examples. In fact, the data set that we created has over 5 million instances. And we see some interesting pronominal performance gaps. So this is a gap between he and she. It's statistically significant. There's a gap between she and they. And actually, there's a gap between everything and they. And this is probably actually the least interesting part of the paper, because this is an example of some of the more technical work, and it focuses a lot on the robustness of this result. So I really delve into like how much of this is just due to repetition of a neopronoun, for example, versus how much of it is due to reasoning. But still, I'm showing you this just as an example of something that would fall under gender gap research in NLP. Leaving aside the fact that like there's a conflation of pronouns and gender here, which is also something that I will talk about later. So this is my first example, and now let's look at another example that I was part of, I don't know, about 5 years ago. The second project is quotes in the news. So people are quoted in the news for various reasons, as experts, as witnesses, as statespeople, etc. So here we have an example article about cats being bored. And the reporter talks to someone called Dr. Claudia Richter, and this is a vet. And Dr. Richter is quoted as saying, sleeping 12 hours, 20 hours a day is not a normal thing for a cat. So people have done manual analyses of who gets quoted in the news and have shown that most of them are men. And so this is a gender gap in how many people are quoted in the news. So who gets to take up space in the news, in the public, who gets to be an expert, etc. You might imagine it's time consuming to trawl through a whole bunch of articles and highlight people, highlight the quotes, do the attribution. And it turns out that there are NLP methods that let you automatically extract and attribute quotes to people with fairly high accuracy. And if you have gender information for them, then you can actually quantify this gender gap in real time at a much, much larger scale. So that's pretty much what we did. This is just one outlet to show you what the data kind of looks like, the results. So there's a large gender gap between the female quotes and the male quotes for this particular Canadian news outlet, BBC News. And in fact, when we looked at more outlets in English news, we saw exactly the same pattern. And the idea essentially of putting all of these results in real time onto a website and spreading awareness about it is that more people know about this gap, news outlets get shamed, and this might lead to change. Reporters might be a little bit more careful about paying attention to this and seeing what they can do about it. Now, if you were paying close attention, you might have noticed that there's something I glossed over in discussing sort of the last couple of projects, and that was the if you have gender information on them. Then you can get these nice bar plots. But actually, it turns out that the way in which we acquire this gender information is one of the most critical things to discuss. And in the second part of my talk, essentially, I want to peel the curtain back on how we did that in the context of the second project and why it actually is the best way to do things. So this is how we actually did it in that paper. I'm going to break this down for you slowly. For every quote, we either had attribution to a pronoun or to a name. So we had one of these two pieces of information for basically everyone, and for floating quotes that were just by themselves, we had ways of attributing them pretty reliably based on linguistics. Then we had 3 buckets of genders to which we assigned the different categories. So he was mapped to man, TM. She was mapped to woman, and they was mapped to other. And then for the names, we had a local cache so that we didn't have to keep making API calls to services. But if we came across a new name, a new first name, then we would go to these online services called Gender API and Genderize and get a binary prediction. So a name like Madeline would get assigned to the woman category. A name like Michael would probably be assigned to the man category. And this leads to a whole bunch of open questions. And hopefully your spidey senses sort of tingling at this point. So question number 1, are pronouns gender? No, they're not. Gender is a complex and multifaceted way of existing in the world and engaging with other people. A pronoun is like one tiny corner of that, and there are more pronouns than he, she, and they. And they also don't directly map to these categories, even if there are maybe statistical tendencies. Another question is what happens with neutral names? So for example, our organization is working hard to address this issue. Alex Smith said, Alex is often a more neutral sounding name, doesn't really have very strong gendered associations for people. And so with this methodology, you would use the first name, you would call one of these APIs, and then even if it's 49% versus 51%, you would assign every single Alex in your entire data set to the 51% category. Another open question is what happens to people like me? What happens to non-binary or agender people who are just named? What if I quoted in the news saying birds are cool? Then essentially, I have to be misgendered somehow. As you saw in the previous diagram, the names always get assigned to one of two binary categories. So we get misgendered and we get miscounted. And what about names that aren't like Madeline and Michael? And so for this, I actually want to do a quick experiment, which I will get you involved in. We're going to do this with some Chinese names. So experiment 1, this is a name with the Chinese characters on top, for those who can read it, and the pin below for those who can't. So who thinks that Chenrui Chao is a man? Show of hands. Okay, who thinks that this is a woman? Okay. Who thinks that this person is non-binary? Okay. So Chenrui Chao is a man, but I've heard that his name in Chinese characters is very like feminine coded. I don't know if people here, if anyone here reads Chinese and like can agree with this or not. Yeah. 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 So this is exactly what my friend said as well. I noticed that you were just sort of shrugging and saying, I don't know, which is the correct answer. So let's just do this two more rounds of this, just to because I think it's also fun. So Yaran Shang, how many of you think that this name is someone who's a woman? Okay. How many of you think that this is a man? And how many of you think that this is someone who's non-binary? Okay, so the wisdom of the crowd actually got it right this time by accident. Most of you said woman. I know one person in the back there actually knows who this is. This is a colleague of mine. And she's actually the one who gave me these names as examples and gave me I can't read Chinese. So also sorry for butchering the pronunciation probably. So she said that with pinyin, that is the romanization, you can't really make any kind of inferences. With the Chinese characters, sometimes people can use like frequency and stereotypes, for example, the flower thing that you mentioned, to make a guess. But essentially, the point of this exercise is if you have no knowledge of Chinese characters, or even if you do and you found it hard, that's expected because it's not a methodology that makes sense. So that's the point that I'm trying to make. I will skip over the last example in the interest of time. If you're curious, this is Mingyang Wang, and she's a woman, but apparently the Chinese characters often get her mistaken for a man. So as I've shown you through the list of open questions and through this little experiment, basically the assumptions of name-based gender inference often misrepresent people's gender, particularly when they have ambiguously gendered names. Completely erases non-binary people. And also, it just fails on a lot of non-Western names. And so the question is, name-based gender inference really simple? And before I go to the next slide where I tell you more about the answer to this, I should also highlight that like this is a very, very popular methodology. And the fact that we have considered singular they at all and even had another category is a miracle. It doesn't happen in the literature. And this happened 5 years ago because of me being involved with the project as a lowly undergrad. And this is actually the work behind this is what is currently my most highly cited paper, but it's kind of disappointing because I completely disagree with the methodology now. But it goes to show essentially that like you can grow as a scientist. That's also one of the lessons of this talk. So who does name-based gender inference really serve? The answer is really it serves cisgender men and women who have heavily gender-associated, typically Western names, which are well represented in these APIs and datasets. So mostly cis white people are who this type of methodology serves. So all of the underlying assumptions of the methodology that I sort of slowly revealed to you are sort of justified. And they're justified basically on the grounds that this is measuring the gender gap, but this might not even represent the majority of the people in your data, depending on your context. Another side issue also is that it treats these categories as monoliths. So I brought back my wage gap figure because even in economics, in wage gap work, unrelated to natural language processing, we see kind of the same things. We see men and women treated as homogenous groups, but this is not the case. And I will show you some wage gap statistics. Unfortunately, a lot of nice pictures for these come from US statistics. So this isn't personalized to our context in Germany or Saarland. But in any case, when we look at wage gaps by gender and race, we see evidence of systemic racism and sexism. So there are actually multiple groups of men who have it worse than white women, in addition to having it worse than white men. And it's different from what the singular view of the gender gap might initially make you think. And Native women, for example, have it worse than like all of the other groups because of the interlocking oppression of racism and sexism and rundown effects of colonialism. When we look at people who are not cis women, we also see more gaps. There's a wage gap between trans men and cis men. And there's of course also a wage gap between trans men and trans women. And once again, all of this is just a manifestation of societal power relations, which is why it's so important to do societal computing. So my point with showing you this is assuming even that you have a perfect methodology. Let's assume that we fixed all of the problems that I showed you earlier about the methodology. Even so, when we operationalize gender gaps in the way that we normally do, which is a way that isolates gender as a single variable and ignores many, many other factors in society, this also hides many other kinds of gaps which can fall through the cracks, and it hides a lot of nuance. So we've seen that aggregated numbers can hide deeper patterns of systemic inequality that only reveal themselves when you split things up a bit more granularly. And this motivates intersectional bias, which is different from intersectionality, where your definitions of bias are not based on single groups, but rather the intersections of multiple characteristics. So your measurements are exactly the same, it's just who you're applying to that's different. You're not using man and woman as categories, it's smaller, different groups of people. So this is a step better, but it is still a method without a politics. And therefore, it is still possible to do intersectional bias, but still suffer from the epistemic issues from before, such as if you infer gender and race from names, and then, basically have more of the same kind of issue. And all you're doing is you're putting a different metric and you're slicing and dicing differently, but you're still doing that. Also, there's intersectional bias about, like intersectional bias papers about predicting criminality from people's faces, which is basically just phrenology. So you can't really cover that with intersectional bias. It's not possible. So all of these problems that I have discussed motivates the third part of my talk, which is essentially where can we go from here? What is a future that we can hope for? What are some recommendations to treat some of these epistemological gaps in how gender is conceptualized and treated? So I have basically 5 recommendations, and I'll go through them one at a time. One recommendation is to go back to the ethical principles of autonomy and justice. So these are 2 principles that underlie applied ethics. Autonomy is this idea that people should have the right to self-determination, and it's very closely linked with informed consent. So in, for example, medical applications, but also obviously in the context of NLP, where humans are affected by what we do. So often when people are just represented in vast quantities of text data, and that's all. And also researchers forget that there's actually people behind it. And especially when they're named, they have a right to self-determine, and a methodology like the one that I showed you really takes that away. It takes that autonomy away. Similarly, justice is about equitable treatment. And therefore, injustice would be, for example, misclassifying someone in a way that would cause them psychological harm through misgendering, or erasing entire categories of individuals using a methodology. So to go back to an earlier example, in the context of quotes in Canadian news, autonomy and justice means something extremely simple, almost so simple that like I can't believe I have to say it. Just ask people how they identify. Collecting this information and also allowing people to, opt out of giving you information lets you get at gender information in a way that lets you preserve autonomy and justice. Every other part of the project was completely fine. Extracting quotes, attributing them to people, all of this stuff can be automated quite reasonably and let you measure what you want. It's just the one part of the where you get the gender from that really has a lot of problems. Some questions at this point that I have actually gotten before, but that I think a focus on autonomy and justice can help with are, one, why don't we just build a data set of non-binary names? There are some bigger problems here, which is that names aren't a gender. Like names are not gender, people have gender, and you can't really know a person's gender without asking them. And when you have a view of gender that includes non-binary people, includes self-identification and autonomy, name-based gender inference just doesn't make any sense. Another thing is, so trans and non-binary people are a minority. Does it even match problems that work 99% of the time? So hopefully, as I've shown you, this number is, first of all, entirely incorrect. There are way, way more people across different parts of society who are affected by this type of methodology. So I also don't think that that's the case, and I don't think that it's compatible with autonomy and justice. And finally, very often, people sort of justify this as, oh, doing it for social good, so like, does it matter? Doesn't it make it okay? And here I would go back to the idea of like intent versus impact. So even something with good intent, the intent of social good, doesn't necessarily count the impact that it has. And also at a personal level, I prefer methodology with politics and methodology with teeth. So as another sort of example of what it might look like to focus on autonomy and justice, many people have now started to write papers where they say things like, oh, we acknowledge that gender is not binary, but we still operationalize it this way, which is a step further. And there's whole ranges in between. There's people who continue to operationalize gender in a completely binary way. There are people who have like a thoughtful section where they say all the limitations and why they do this anyway. But I would like to present an alternative as well from Lauscher et al. Anna Lauscher, she's a prof at Saarland University, and we're now even collaborating. But when this paper first came out, I just thought she was really cool because she essentially made the normative argument that neopronouns, which you can see some examples of here, apart from he and she and singular they, are an emerging phenomenon in English and also in many other languages as well. And in fact, there's maybe even some argument about whether it's an emerging phenomenon because many neopronouns have been around for decades. And so her normative argument is this exists, this is a thing in society, and we have to make sure that our NLP systems serve these users and can handle this, so at least quantify how we're doing on neopronouns. So this is a different way of viewing the thing. Instead of just saying, oh, let's throw up our hands, this is a limitation, this is all we can do. This involves more creativity and thinking like, how can we serve the users who are typically underserved? Point number 2 is embrace complexity. And I think this is one point that is strongly in conflict with computer science as a field and computer science as sort of epistemology. We're really encouraged to simplify, reduce, to clean, complex, and messy data to solve everything technically with computation. But the reality is just that the world is full of social identity and interaction, and all of this is very messy and complex, and requires more sort of socio-technical solutions. And the complexity of the world is actually a beautiful thing. So in terms of concrete suggestions, one of the things to do is to reject single axis thinking. The reason that I put this image here is when I was looking for wage gaps, like wage gap images for this presentation, I found this, and I think it's a really good example of single axis thinking from people, even when they're trying to like address an issue. So it just shows essentially that like a white woman and a black man are at the same level, and that's below a white man. And this also sort of erases the co-occurrence of gender and race. So black woman is entirely missing from the picture. And of course, you know, this is, I don't mean to pick on this image. It's an image. It's meant to simplify. It's meant to present an accessible topic. But I still think that it's useful to illustrate a pattern that I see in studies without, you know, putting a whole bunch of papers up on the slide. Another thing that I think is useful is using mixed methods for research. And this is another aspect in which I think computer science, with its extremely quantitative focus and positivist focus as well, tends to forget that like you can ask people, and that is data, and that is a legitimate way of finding things out about society. So qualitative research methods include interviews, surveys, case studies, focus groups, ethnographic research. I haven't done all of these, but I think they're all cool. I think I've done interviews, surveys, and case studies. So this is important. Also, just expanding methodology. Another one that's perhaps very obvious, and especially why I love that I'm giving this talk to an explicitly interdisciplinary audience at an institute with the word interdisciplinary in its name, is that I think it's very important to read and collaborate very broadly to expand our notions of how we think about a lot of things. So specifically in the context of gender, there's a very nice paper by Hannah Devaney et al. About the theories of gender in NLP. And essentially they do a big survey of a whole bunch of NLP papers and look at the conceptualization, which in many cases actually is undefined. There is no framework, or it's underspecified. And of course, there are also, you know, binary and essentialist sort of folk views of gender. And so it's very important to read outside, to read, for example, gender theory, queer theory, critical theory, intersectionality scholars, critical disability scholarship, etc., to really enhance and deepen our science and how we come up with these solutions for socio-technical problems. Point number 4 is methodology with a politics. This is something I've hinted at a couple of times in my presentation. And I will show you two examples that are related to work that I've been part of. So one is going back to the concept of intersectionality, which is different from intersectional bias. They often get mixed up, but intersectionality is a critical framework of theory and praxis. So it means you're not just theorizing and writing papers about things, but you're also actually, you know, thinking about how it works in your daily life, in your real life. And it also has the explicit goal of dismantling power relations and oppression because of this grounding in praxis in social justice. And so something that you could never do if your politics and your justice and your conceptualizations of gender, etc., are coming from intersectionality or perhaps informed by intersectionality is you would never apply intersectional bias to phrenology. You would see right through that. You wouldn't do predictive policing. And so the image here is from a talk about some work that I actually presented at the opening of this institute in a poster. But it was studying how intersectionality is treated in NLP papers. And we found that most often they say intersectionality, but then they operationalize just intersectional bias. And so these 6 things are the tenets of intersectionality by the critical scholar Patricia Hill Collins. You might have heard of Kimberly Crenshaw in the context of intersectionality, but Patricia Hill-Collins is also a very big name in that field. Another idea is democracy. I have just wrapped up some work, which is to be published soon, on how democracy and democratization is conceptualized in AI. So it's really popular these days, you might have noticed, if you read NLP papers, to say that work is democratizing AI or democratizing NLP. And so we kind of try to make an attempt at investigating all of the papers in pre-machine learning conferences and the entire ACL anthology, if this means anything to you, to see how democracy is used and operationalized. And we also spend a bit of time thinking, like, what should it mean, actually? So how can we use theories of democracy, of which there's like 4,000 years of scholarship from the social sciences, to build towards a more inclusive future? And this is in stark contrast how it actually is currently in NLP, where if you look at the bar graph, most papers mention the word democratizing or democracy just one time, and then that's it. There's a very, very long tail. There's no real engagement with what it actually might mean to have democratic AI. Point number 5 is to reject objectivity. This might be one of the hardest ones because computer scientists are not really exposed to the wide variety of epistemologies and perspectives that are out there. And we're also not made aware that our perspective is situated, to quote Don Haraway. This is just the idea that a lot of science has this objective perspective where there's only one way of seeing things and you can objectively see it from nowhere. It's the view from nowhere. And so what we really need is epistemic humility, to know that there's many ways of knowing things, there's many different knowledges out there, they're all valid. It's not just quantitative and positivist data. And I think that reading sort of science and technology studies literature and feminist epistemology can really give us tools to reject objectivity. So that's it. This is a summary of my 5 points that I just outlined towards a hopeful future. I'm happy to take questions now, or also that's my website, diptrust.com, and you can. I'm also happy to receive email about it later.